Greetings, everyone, and welcome to the weekly Facebook Live Bible Study, Week 12. Last week, we finished up Deuteronomy. We talked about Moses' final words to the people of Israel. We also concluded Acts, and we talked about the missions of the apostles. This week, we're going to introduce the book of Joshua. We're going to talk about who Joshua is, the Israelites crossing into the land that God has promised Abraham, and the Israelites taking that land. We're also going to introduce Romans. We're going to talk about the themes in the first half of the book, and we're also going to talk about what Paul means to say to the people of Rome. Now, the book of Joshua is named for its main character, Joshua. This book is one of the first historical books. The historical books come after the Pentateuch, and these books tell the story of Israel's entry into the Promised Land, their life under judges, their transition towards kingship, the division of this nation into two rival kingdoms, the downfall and exile of both of these kingdoms, the life in exile, and Judah's return from exile. Now, the book of Joshua mainly focuses on the second part of God's work of redemption in the Old Testament period. Before, the Lord redeemed his people out of Egypt under Moses. Now, the Lord will bring his people into the land of promise and give them rest through Joshua. The purpose of this book is to recount the events surrounding Israel's capture and settlement of the land of Canaan, with an emphasis on God's faithfulness in fulfilling his promise to the ancestors Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The two topics that we're going to be looking at today are crossing into the land and taking the land. Let's start by our first topic, crossing into the land. Now, Joshua, the new Moses, is called to lead God's people into this land, take it, and divide it among themselves as their inheritance from the Lord. Now, Joshua has been groomed for this task by Moses and by God himself. God speaks to Joshua and charges him to assume the leadership position. Joshua then takes charge and sends 2 spies to gather intelligence about the territory they are to soon take. What these 2 spies counteract the bad report given by the 12 spies earlier, and these 2 spies end up at a woman's house, Rahab, a prostitute. She hides them from the king's men, and they give her a scarlet cord to ensure that her and her family's safety, and the spies return to the camp. Later, the people cross the Jordan, and Joshua exalts God by setting up memorial stones taken from the riverbed. Through Joshua's leading the people safely through the river, the Lord exalts Joshua so that the people stand in awe of him just as they stood in awe of Moses. Troops then pass over a broad plain between Jericho and the Jordan River. The crossing of the land ends with the ritual renewal and divine encounters. Before Israel did anything to take the land, the Lord went before and demoralized the enemy so that the enemy was didn't have any spirit in them. The men were then circumcised under Joshua's command a second time. Now let's move into our second topic for Joshua, which is taking the land. So now that the Israelites have entered the land, they have to conquer it. The Lord gives Jericho into their hands. The people of Israel were instructed to leave no survivals. So in the process of taking Jericho, the people march around the territory for 7 days. The fall of Jericho quickly follows. However, Israel's victory doesn't last that long. Joshua launches an attack on the city of Ai, but there's no divine mandate to do so by God. The people of Israel broke faith. The real perpetrator, Achan, angers the Lord and leads to Israel's first defeat in the land of Canaan. Achan begins the canonization of Israel. Israel makes the second attempt to capture Ai and then is successful. After taking Ai, the people have a special ceremony near Shechem. The whole incident reminds the people that success only comes from following God's instruction. This idea, or reminder, is constantly seen as the people of Israel capture the south and then take over the north. Now let's move on to Romans. The Apostle Paul wrote the book of Romans from Corinth on his 3rd missionary journey. After completing his work in the eastern part of the Roman Empire, he had hoped to travel to Rome and preach there. Now, the main overarching theme of Romans is that the revelation of God's judging and saving righteousness in the gospel of Jesus Christ. In the cross of Christ, God judges sin and yet at the same time manifests his saving mercy. Romans provides the fullest expression of Paul's theology, but one important thing to remember is that Romans is not intended to be a complete summary statement because it lacks many detailed explanations of Paul's doctrine of Christ, of the church, or of the last things. So Paul mainly wrote this book to address particular issues to the concern with the Roman church. He addressed matters that had a church that included both Jewish and Gentile Christians. Some of the matters he addressed is how can one be right with God through obeying the law? What can be learned from Abraham as the father of both the Jewish and Gentile Christians? What role does the law play with reference to sin? What does salvation of Gentiles mean about the future of Israel as God's people? And should Christians observe the Old Testament food laws, and how should they relate to other believers on these matters? Now, Paul hoped that by answering these questions, he would instill unity within the church, so that the Romans may be united in the gospel and that they could comprehend how the gospel spoke to the issues that divided them. Paul longs for the Gentiles to come to obedience of faith for the sake of Jesus' name. The first half of the book can be divided into 4 sections. 1. The gospel as the revelation of the righteousness of God. 2. God's righteousness in his wrath against sinners. 3. The saving righteousness of God. 4. Hope as a result of righteousness by faith. The gospel as the revelation of the righteousness of God. Now in here, Paul includes his opening salutation, thanksgiving, and his statement of the overall theme of Romans. Paul talks about the gospel in extreme detail because he had never been to Rome, and he wanted to summarize the gospel in the best way for his Roman readers. In this section, Paul expresses his desire to come to Rome because he had a special call to proclaim the gospel to all people. He also explains why he is so eager to preach the gospel everywhere. Because the gospel is a saving power of God, in which righteousness is revealed. God's righteousness and his wrath against sinners. Now this section shows that God's wrath is being righteously revealed against all people, both Jews and Gentiles. Now since we all have sinned and fallen short of God's glory, God's wrath is righteously revealed because people suppress the truth about the one true God and then turn to idolatry. Paul makes sure to also mention that the Jews are not exempt from God's judgment. Paul uses the Old Testament to charge both Jews and Gentiles with sin. He prepares them for his claim that what's standing with God is available for those who trust in the death and the resurrection of Christ. The saving righteousness of God. Paul makes the point that since no one can be righteous before God by keeping the law, one can go on the correct righteous path by standing with God through faith in atoning work of Jesus on the cross. God's saving righteousness has been manifested in the death of Jesus Christ, so God's justice and love are reconciled on the cross. Paul also makes the claim that both Jews and Gentiles obtain a right standing with God by faith alone. Paul uses Abraham as a prime example to show how justification by faith works. Hope as a result of righteousness by faith. The central theme of this section is that believers in Christ who are righteous in God's sight have a certain hope of future glory and life eternal. Those who are justified by faith have an unshakable hope, knowing that they will be saved from God's wrath on the day of judgment by virtue of Christ's death on their behalf. Paul reminds the people that the law does not and cannot conquer sin, but the grace given to the followers of Christ triumphs over sin and death. That concludes the first half of Joshua and Romans. If you have any questions, we ask that you post them and that we can address them and grow together in Christ. Thank you.